and a very warm welcome to the television podcast from the Royal Television Society London, with me, your host, Nadine Dereza.
And me, your other host, Andrew Eborn. Every month we review some of the biggest television events and news stories with the assistance of a fantastic all-star panel, which we personally plucked from a rich pool of contributors and journalists, including titans of television, media moguls, and industry giants who live and breathe TV.
And in this episode, we're turning the spotlight on the electrifying world of music on TV, because this June sees a clutch of music festivals, including the 20th anniversary of the Download Festival. Of course, we've got the Isle of Wight Festival, and what many regard the ultimate festival. What am I talking about? Glastonbury is in town, and we're going to explore how televising of these iconic music gatherings has evolved over time. And we have some very special guests on the show today, including Alison Howe, executive producer of BBC Glastonbury, as well as Harvey Goldsmith, the legendary producer and promoter of rock concerts. And later on in the show, we'll be joined by Frances Taylor, who's the previews editor at the Radio Times, and she'll be selecting her top picks for June.
But before all of that, some exciting news. We had the wonderful Matt Laycock, you might remember from Barb Audiences, on the show, and he was talking about Eurovision and Coronation and his predictions for what the audience figures might be. Well, surprise, surprise, he actually was pretty right. We've got the figures just in. The Eurovision final on BBC had an audience of 10.2 million views, which I understand is the best Eurovision has ever had. And the Coronation actually a bit down from what Her Majesty's funeral, which was 28 million, but as predicted, they still got a great audience, about 19 million viewers for that as well.
Wow, good to get an update on those viewing figures from Barb Audiences. But let's start the programme, and of course we're going to start with Glastonbury. So Glastonbury Festival has come a long way since its humble beginnings back in 1970, when the festival was only 1 day and £1 a ticket. Today, Glastonbury is the largest greenfield music and performing arts festival in the world, and in so many ways has formed a template for all the festivals that have come after it. The famous pyramid stage attracts the highest profile artists, but a lot of the best experiences are to be found out on the outskirts, off the beaten track, and where you least expect them. And the BBC will be broadcasting throughout the festival. And to tell us more about this year's coverage, who better than the award-winning Alison Howe, executive producer of Glastonbury. Alison, welcome to the television podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for asking me.
No, it's great to have you. And just looking at your biography, I mean, you've got so much experience at working at the BBC. Just give us a sense of some of the work that you've done. I know you've worked with some of the biggest artists in the world.
I have, which I'm very blessed about. And I've actually also been lucky enough to work in some capacity or other for the BBC at Glastonbury since 1992, I think it was my first year, when I was just starting out on my career in broadcasting, and I worked at Radio 1 with the likes of John Peel, Andy Kershaw. We did some radio shows at Glastonbury for a few years, and then in 1998 I joined the TV team and have been part of it and latterly leading it ever since. And it's an absolute pleasure, and as I've said previously, the best job in the world, because it is the best festival in the world, so I must have the best job in the world.
You certainly do. And hopefully I've worn Glastonbury attire today, especially for you, Alison, because I know you've worked with the likes of Adele, Ed Sheeran, Stormzy, Arctic Monkeys, giving them their TV debuts and so much more. But let's have a look at the coverage for this year. I know last year saw the return of Glastonbury after an enforced break, and BBC's coverage in 2022 was bigger in scale and range than ever before. So what can the TV audience expect in 2023 in terms of scale and range of coverage for this year?
Well, you're right in that last year when we returned, we wanted to come back bigger and better than ever before. And, you know, some of those things will be returning this year. We had last year was our first year of having a dedicated hosted channel on BBC iPlayer during the afternoon when the traditional TV coverage isn't able to be on. and that was a real triumph for us, and something we're going to do more of this year. You know, there's a real appetite from the audience to see what's happening on site during the afternoon. And, you know, the way we did it last year, we're doing a bit more of it this year, is like a real step forward in that kind of immersive experience of seeing the festival at home. So we're doing more of that. We're filming the pyramid stage in UHD 4K again this year, which is exciting because lots of people enjoyed having access to that last year. And we're just going to be on TV more. I mean, I actually look at the number of hours we're potentially going to be doing. It's over 40 currently across BBC 1, 2, 3 and 4, the most we'll have ever done. Slightly daunting, but equally that's because people want it, and the BBC, you know, loves it. It's a big part of, you know, the BBC planning every year. So the more we can do, the better for the audience.
Absolutely. And it's changed, obviously. It's evolved with how we view and consume TV. So the digital live streams and being able to watch Glastonbury on demand, you know, how important is that as part of the mix?
Really important. I mean, you know, it feels sort of just what we do, but you know, it's good to remember how sort of revolutionary it was when it first started. In that, you know, people, as we know, people consume culture in lots of different ways. So, you know, if you're an artist performing on one of the big sort of 5 main music stages at the festival, there's so many different ways you can get to an audience, sometimes a brand new audience, and that can be live through the stream, or it can be later in the day on the kind of TV highlights. It can be in single form on the BBC YouTube channel. It can be on the radio, either 6 Music or Radio 2 or Radio 1. So there's just different. The BBC really brings together all its platforms into sort of one place, and the team that work on it work together to ensure that the navigation around all those platforms works for the audience, so they know where they can find the artists they're looking for.
And how about the BBC's dedicated Glastonbury channel? What can we get from that we can't, say, get on the mainstream channels?
So the iPlayer channel is on sort of from midday through until the early evening, and literally goes right up to when BBC 1 or BBC 2 comes on air. And what it is you can live in the moment of what's happening at Glastonbury through curated, hosted coverage, and be, you know, taken around the stages and get a real sense of something that might be happening there and then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Previously, we'd have to wait until the TV networks came on air and almost sort of treat it as highlights. Whereas with the iPlayer channel, you can be in the moment, and Glastonbury like to have surprises on its stages. So, you know, often there would be a surprise guest. Again, we'd sort of slightly be behind the news in terms of turnout around, but with the iPlayer channel, we can treat it live in the sort of more traditional way of the networks.
And how about the planning for this year's Glastonbury? When did that actually start for the BBC?
You know, it's quite a small team. I work out of BBC Studios, and we have a small team, and for quite a long period from, you know, the end of the previous festival, probably right up until the end of the calendar year, it's really very small amount of people who are starting to think about their coverage for the following year. Myself, I've got a line producer, and we have a technical manager, and we just, you know, we debrief on the previous year, talk about things we could do better or differently, and at the same time start to have perhaps monthly meetings with the wider team at the BBC to see if there's things that the digital team want to try for the next year, and just start to, while there's a bit of thinking time, just throw around ideas of what we can do, you know, the following years. So, you know, that we have that time that goes up until sort of, you know, January, and then we really start to meet in a bigger way with all our colleagues in online, radio, press, marketing, you know, the editorial team, and just start to, you know, as we get more information from the festival itself, you know, how the cover might be shaped? What sort of artists have they locked in? What channel might they broadcast on? And just really just start to because even though it's the same every year in that it's a festival on a farm in Somerset, every year the artists make it that bit different. The conversations are different. The broadcast can be slightly different. So, we kind of have a knowledge of doing Glastonbury, but every year there are new challenges and new things to work through.
And having attended Glastonbury myself on many occasions, I'd imagine just thinking about the size of the audience around you and the varieties of weather we get, what are the practicalities of actually televising festivals? And what lessons have you and your team learnt over the years from broadcasting from this site, from this farm?
We've learnt some hard lessons, particularly weather related. Some of us that have been doing it for a while have done some very bad weather years. You dig deep at those points, particularly when your whole set is underwater and you have to find somewhere else to broadcast. We've learned some hard lessons. And when people join our team and do their first Glastonbury, we always say to them, if the weather's good, just treat that as an extra bonus, because when the weather's good, you don't think about the weather. You might make sure people are drinking enough water or, looking after themselves. But the minute the weather's bad, it just, the whole production takes on a new feel. You have to think about how people are getting on site, their welfare, the conditions of the site in terms of the OB infrastructure. It just brings a lot of challenges. And again, because we've got this small core of a group team across the BBC, many of which have experienced those conditions and those challenges, I think it gives everybody the confidence that we've if we have to deal with a bad year, hopefully that won't happen this year, but if we did, then everyone feels safe and secure in that we've learnt lessons from previous times, and whatever's thrown at us, we'll work it out. And quite often when the weather has been bad, that becomes the story of the festival. So people are looking to you as broadcasters to reflect that story. You become the story, as we know quite often happens. So we have to bear that in mind, as well as still trying to deliver all the big live performances. We have to deliver the story as well.
Yeah, I remember 1997 seeing Radiohead, and that was a very muddy year, and I've still got scars from that. Now, sound, it sounds sort of obvious, but it must be important, that audio experience. So how much attention is paid to that?
A lot. I mean, a really kind of talented group of people who we work with in BBC Public Service, look after all the live sound on all the stages. And we work collectively with artists, because at something like Glastonbury, the pictures and the sound are equally important. So there's a real effort and an amount of time put into working with artists to achieve the best sound for them. We all work in music, sort of content all year round. So quite often we will have relationships with artists already, which helps, but sometimes an artist will appear that we've not worked with before, so we have to put that extra effort in to build the trust. And luckily the BBC brand and the Glastonbury brand together really help, because I guess our reputation goes before us, and that often helps sort of bring the kind of teams together with the artists to make them feel secure. Because you go out on a stage, particularly the Pyramid stage, you probably haven't had a sound check, and you're at the whim of social media and everything. So it's important to us that artists have a really great experience.
Now, you've mentioned that Glastonbury is a great brand for the BBC to broadcast, but how does it actually compare to other music programming in terms of audience ratings?
It's right at the top, I would say. I mean, obviously, it depends if you're talking about pure music performance or things like the concert recently for the coronation and things. But it's right up there. You often find with Glastonbury, an awful lot of people will consume it over the weekend that perhaps wouldn't necessarily watch a lot of music programming the rest of the time, because in a way it's more than that. It's a cultural event. It's like the people who watch the FA Cup final but don't watch football the rest of the year or watch the Grand National. It's in that territory.
Now, I don't know if you can answer the last question without offending potential artists, but who have been your personal favourite legendary headline sets or sets at Glastonbury, and who are you looking most forward to seeing this year? So a little bit of a look back and then a look forward to the coming weeks.
It's so hard because in a way I love so many artists who've performed at Glastonbury, and there's been so many favourites. I suppose the one that will always stick in my mind will be Beyonce, because it felt like a real game changer. The amount of effort and planning and production and thought she put into her show, but so specific around that particular stage on that particular evening. And I'll never forget suddenly looking at the front line of the crowd, looking back at her in front of that stage, and it was just full of women, full of young women, which, you know, back then wasn't necessarily the norm. And it just felt to me like a real game-changing moment, and of course an incredible show that, you know, we're all incredibly proud of. So I suppose that I always come back to that one.
Alison, thank you so much for joining us on the television podcast. It's been fantastic to get your insights, and you know, we wish you all the best with the coverage for 2023, and I think you definitely have the best job in the world. Thanks again.
Thank you, and do send us some sunshine, because we never take anything for granted.
Our next guest is Harvey Goldsmith, an iconic and visionary producer and promoter of concerts, charity events and television broadcasts. Working with most of the world's major artists, including the Rolling Stones, The Who, Pink Floyd, Bruce Springsteen and Luciano Pavarotti, Harvey has successfully managed, produced and promoted shows that have shaped the music industry and revolutionised television coverage of events. Among his extraordinary achievements, Harvey orchestrated two of the most monumental televised music events ever held: Live Aid in 1985 and Live 8 20 years later in 2005. Together they leveraged the power of music to unite and inspire global audiences. I was lucky enough to catch up with Harvey a little bit earlier. Harvey Goldsmith, thank you very much for joining us and welcoming us to your office here in the heart of London. How long have you been here?
5 years.
Where were you before?
Round the corner.
Oh, it's easy that way, isn't it?
Next street.
Next street, there we go. A joy. Bob Geldof, who you've been working with Boomtown Rats and the Jam and various other damn bands that you liked. He knocks on your door, having had the success of Do They Know It's Christmas, and says, I want to do a concert. Tell me about that.
The Band-Aid record, we all had seen these TV pictures that Michael Burke put out on the 6 o'clock news. Never before, to my knowledge, had anybody seen pictures of kids and people starving. They'd never been seen before. And so we were all mesmerised by it. Bob and Mitch went one stage further, wrote the song, and then recorded the record with initially it didn't have anybody, but then one by one they all pitched up. And started this whole genre of activity. And he didn't want to go, but he was pushed into going to Africa because he felt, I'm not here. It's not an entertainment thing I'm doing. You know, we've done our bit. Anyway, he went to Africa and he realised it was the tip of the iceberg. So while he was there, his thoughts came together and he came back and he said, basically, we've got to do some more. We've got to raise more money. How do we do it? And so we've got to do a concert. So he started badgering me. And it wasn't that I was unresponsive, but I was really up to my neck. I was looking, Roger Waters had split from the Pink Floyd, and I was producing his first solo tour. He just recorded his first solo album. We were putting these ideas together. We were opening at Radio City in New York. George Michael was in Wham at the time, and I did every concert of any sort that Wham had ever done, and was very close to them. And Simon Napier Bell, their manager, phoned me up one day and said, I'm in Hong Kong. I said, great, because he was kind of half based away from England. He said, we're going to do 2 concerts at the Coliseum in Hong Kong. I said, oh, great. And then we're going to China. I can't go to China, so you'll have to go. And he put the phone down.
So you came back from China. It always seemed to be up to the last minute, and you arrive in your office and you have a visitor.
Yeah, Bob came to see me, and he was kind of waiting for me and said, we've got to do this concert. And he gave me the dates he wanted to do. I said, no, you can't have those dates. Bruce Springsteen's doing them. He said, well, Bruce Springsteen will be part of it. I said, I doubt it, because that wasn't his way. Anyway, it was 10.5 weeks from start to finish.
Before the concert. And this is the extraordinary thing. You talk about things being last minute. Actually, July the 13th, 1985, a few weeks before that. Last minute, you obviously getting a broadcaster on board and doing effectively 16 hours of live music was a first. How did that come about?
Bob went to see Mark McCormack. Mark McCormack, eventually, he run all the various broadcasts. Eventually went to Channel 4, and Channel 4 said they'd give him 2 hours. So we had 2 hours in our back pocket, and I said, that's not good. And Bob said, no. So I knew the old Grey Whistle Test people very well. I'd been on the show a number of times, and I knew Mike Appleton. So I phoned Mike Appleton up, and I said, you've got to help me out. We've got this idea, we're going to do this show, and he got totally involved in it. I said, who do we talk to? So he said, I'll talk to the head of daytime television, which I subsequently found out there wasn't a head of daytime television at the time. But he had some role or other that equated to it. His name was Roger Lawton. We went to see Roger Lawton, and he was terribly sympathetic because he himself had given money because of the results of those pictures on the news and the Band Aid record. He said, I don't know if we could do this, because Bob kept banging the table, so we've got to show the whole concert. And by that time, which was about 3 weeks in, Bob had convinced me we had to do a show in America as well. We didn't have a show in America, but they didn't know that. So he said, we're going to have a show in America as well. And Roger looked and said, the test matches are on. I don't know. We might be able to split the broadcast between BBC One and BBC Two. I'll go and see the Director General and see what he says. And the last thing that happened was, it was a Friday afternoon, Bob said, I want the answer Monday morning. Anyway, Roger did his trick. He went to see Michael Gray. Michael Gray thought about it over the weekend, and on following Tuesday, he phoned up and said, I've thought about it. I'm going to clear the schedule. And from that point onwards, we had a show.
Yeah. And everything fell into place at that stage. What was extraordinary and legendary on that sort of basis is that you had a press conference at Wembley, and at that stage you didn't have any other acts other than the Boomtown Rats.
We had the Boomtown Rats.
You had the Boomtown Rats, who couldn't quite fill 16 hours, as great as they are. And Ultravox, because of Mitch's involvement.
That was it.
That was it. And the press, biggest press pack you have seen.
Ever.
So tell me about that moment and what Bob did.
We were in the ballroom of Wembley Stadium. I think there were 480 members of the press there. I've never seen anything like it. Press, TV, radio and general media. There was myself and John Kennedy and me, and I sat next to Bob, and I got up, thanks everybody, Bob got up and said, we're going to do this concert, whatever. And somebody, one of the journalists, put his hand up and said, who's playing? And he just rattled off a list of names. And I literally was kicking him. I was kicking his shin under the table. I said, shut up, great. None of them. But anyway, he announced this long list of names, that all the ones he could think of. And then when we got out, I said, "Are you nuts? What do you mean? Who? None of them. Not one anyway. They all, one by one, most of them fell into place. That's how it worked. But it was hysterical.
And very interesting. As you say, once one person's in place, say, well, such and such is doing it, and then for everybody else.
Well, everybody calls everybody else. It's the standard way of the way things work. And they, so word got out, and one act would call the other act, "You doing it? What do you think?" Blah, blah, blah. And eventually we ended up, of course, with more acts than we needed, which is always the case.
Always the case. And interesting from a running order point of view, a lot of it was dictated as much by the show, but also from a technical requirements. Talk to me about that.
I put my foot down and said, this show will run the way I want to run it, because otherwise I can't guarantee, A, that we'll end each act on time, B, I don't want long changeovers because they're awful. And so you just got to leave it to me to figure out how to put this together. And I sat down with my technical guys, and between us, we worked out the way to do it. And then we came up with the idea of this turntable stage. So we had one act loading on, one act performing, and one act coming off, and it just turned. And even though it broke down the night before, on the day it worked brilliantly.
Yeah, what I loved about that story is that you say your team were exhausted in the morning. It wasn't working, it wasn't turning.
The night before it wasn't, no.
And so you had to bribe them with beer, I think, in the morning, didn't you?
Yeah, I said, we'll just send out for a load of mice and put them in a treadwheel. They'll do it.
And you also had acts, because obviously some people are going to have the ABC, I think, were only doing 2 hours as opposed to MTV, who were doing total broadcast. You'd have the heads of industry phoning you up and telling you, we've got to make sure we're in the 2-hour version.
Yeah, the night before was awful. It started off with my production manager phoning me up about 9 o'clock saying the turntable's not working and everybody's going home. In which case I went to the off-licence, bought 3 crates of beer and drove down to Wembley and just sat everybody, gave them all a beer, and we figured out how to get the thing working. Some piece of scaffolding or something got caught in the turntable. That's what it was. So we fixed that. I got home about midnight, pretty exhausted, and the phone started ringing, and it was Tommy Mottola, who was the head of Glastonbury, saying, and he was managing Hall & Oates at the time, and he said, Hall & Oates aren't on the ABC TV special. And I'm going, and he said, if you don't put them on, I'm going to pull Mick Jagger and Tina Turner or whatever. And it was at the point, I said, just do whatever you want, care less. But Bill Graham phoned up and said, Black Sabbath have got to be on it because I'm doing their merchandising. Well, so what? As much as I love Black Sabbath, and I did, because I did all their touring. But nevertheless, it just got to the point where we had what we had. We had to make it work. We couldn't deviate from it. The timing was everything. Yeah. The key principle of that show was timing. And on the morning of the concert, I woke up very early, and I was really thankful because the sun was out, because you never know what was going to happen. And I got down to the venue at about, 8 o'clock in the morning. And I sent out for 40 clocks. And clocks about that big. Yeah. And I put these clocks everywhere with a little note underneath. So I don't care what time you go on, but I do care what time you come off. Please stick to your allotted time. And of course, everybody did. I mean, I've never seen, a lot of the acts were notorious about being late going on stage. George was the worst. Elton would go on when he was ready, and it didn't matter what you said or what you did. When he was ready, he'd go on stage, and so on and so forth. A lot of acts were. We just couldn't afford to have any delays whatsoever. It was split timing, because we were also conscious that there were satellites somewhere in the sky, and we had to hit a certain point when we'd get the programming from America. Everybody was played the game. Every act was waiting on the side of the stage 5 minutes before they were even being called. So it just worked brilliantly.
And it was a seismic moment in terms of television. How do you think television changed as a result of it?
I don't know about television, but showbiz changed as a result of it, because what the media figured out was that music sold newspapers. And up to that point, it was really the only time you'd read about artists was when they'd either been busted or were getting divorced. That was it. So the cult of celebrity came out of that. For TV was quite proud of itself because it realised it could raise a lot of money.
Right.
And so out of that came Children in Need and that kind of thing.
It was the start of all the big telethons and things like that.
Yeah.
And you also had Live 8 a few years later. You decided to do it all again on the 2nd of July, 2005. I was there, thanks to you. The biggest collection of
Live
artists.
8 was different.
225 artists.
Live 8 was completely different. We didn't want to do Live 8. The trustees of the Band Aid Trust, the same trustees, with the exception of Maurice Oberstein, who unfortunately passed away, from the get-go. And we all met beforehand, 2007. In fact, we probably started in 2006 thinking about it. And so we decided to put out the DVD. And then there was this call, because we were hosting the G8 concert, G8 meetings concert. And what came about was that Africa wasn't on the agenda anywhere. And so there was a whole movement of people who were quite determined to put Africa on the agenda for the leaders of the G8 countries to talk about it. And the pressure came, strangely enough, from Bono, U2, from Madonna and from Elton. And they were really pressurising us to do something. And that's how it came about. We had no intention of doing it at all. But it was a pressure point. The whole idea of Live 8 was to put pressure on the leaders of the world's biggest economies to put to put Africa on the agenda and to ensure that there were some beneficial results to those countries, forgiving the debt and so on and so forth. And so there was a whole list of requests that we put in. And what happened was we put enough pressure on that they actually did it. Right. And so with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, they put it, it became on the agenda. And then they started, the foreign ministers first, and then they started to really discuss how to deal with that. Because up to then, they'd never talked about it.
And it's the power of the media, isn't it? You have, 160 television stations, 400 radio stations around the world. Was it a lot easier the second time round?
Yes.
They now knew what was going to happen?
Yes. The only problem we had was with the parks and the police. Everybody else was great. All the territories were great, all the countries. We did, 7 shows or 8 shows in total around the world all at the same time. All the governments got it, everybody got it, except the parks and the police.
Right. And this is interesting because you've been the catalyst, if you like, for the relationship with television and the music industry. And it's recognised because the music industry's evolved so much, hasn't it? So you used to make your money from the records and then basically you do touring for next to nothing. And then TV is a shop window.
Promoting the record, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think the next stage is going to be?
God knows. It's a mess. The business is actually in a mess. There's no sustainability. There's no genres. It's too wide, too much opportunity. The whole demographics of how artists earn their money is now completely shifted. It's all live, and live's just about greed and money. So, and acts that are popular today, by the time you figured out the name of the track and the name of the act, they're gone. So it's the old pop days. And so I don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, music's not going to die because it's embedded in everybody's lives, whoever you are. But it's become a different animal. And of course, artists are breaking through because they always broke through, they always will do. It will evolve into something else. Whatever that is, I'm not sure what it is. I hope it does, and I hope it's positive, but I get the feeling we're kind of at the bottom of the run because the dinosaur acts are dying out, even though they're selling more tickets today than they sold in their heyday at 50 times higher prices. Ticket prices are completely off the scale. Part of the damage that's been done by the top echelon of acts charging so much for the tickets is that people don't have the money to invest as a punt to go and see a new act.
Sure. And the biggest lessons learned?
I think with filming, you have to think very carefully. We did, when Pavarotti passed away, we did a tribute to Pavarotti in Petra, which on its own was the most extraordinary place I've ever been to in my life, which is this oasis inside a mountain where there's no power, no electricity, no nothing, and this beautiful sculptured buildings called the Treasury of the Ancestry and so on and so on. We did a tribute concert there, was having a director that understands what music is. What happens today is most music TV shows that you see, you've got a director who's got itchy fingers and he's constantly changing the camera vision. So you're just about getting your head round looking at this artist performing from a medium shot, and suddenly it's flashed over here, then it's over there, then it's up here, then it's a long shot back. They're doing it the same with the proms. If you look at the classical music style of directing, it's exactly the same. It's bloody awful. And they ought to grow up and think about what they're doing. Because if you're watching a piece of Mozart or Beethoven or whatever with a big orchestra, you want to focus in on what's going on. And yes, you want to see the soloist. What you don't want to have is every 5 seconds, another camera shot, another camera shot, another camera shot, which is what they did on Top of the Pops 30 years ago. Grow up.
Harvey Goldsmith, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Well, we come to one of our regular features here on the Television Podcast, and welcome to the fantastic Frances Taylor, who is the preview editor of the Radio Times. How are you doing, Frances?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've done your usual thing of ploughing the fields and working out what we might be watching during the upcoming months. And one of your first picks is something called Changing Ends with the wonderful Alan Carr. Tell us about that.
It's really lovely, actually. And I think it might be a bit easy to miss because it's on ITVX, which, again, they've had a lot of publicity about. But I still think if you go out in the street and say people, are you a regular viewer of ITVX? You might not find too many subscribers. So I'd say this is a brilliant show to kind of drive people to the streaming platform. It's a sort of semi-autobiographical comedy about Alan Carr and his early years in 1980s Northampton. And for people who aren't too aware of Alan's story, his dad is actually a guy called Graham Carr, who was a former footballer and later went on to become a football manager. And he was very keen that his son also got into football, but Alan was far more interested in acting, dancing, and as we see here, Agatha Christie. I have to say, the standout performance in this comedy is the actor Oliver Savell, who plays the young Alan. I mean, he has the glasses, they've given him some lovely teeth, and it's really affectionate and a lovely portrayal. It's not a caricature, it's a exaggerated performance, I'd say, of a young Alan, but it really hits the spot. And I think the other lovely element to this, because although it's a drama that runs through, and as I say, it's quite period because it's set in the 80s, Alan Carr actually appears himself today, sort of standing on the sidelines in sort of a breaking the fourth wall kind of thing. So he addresses the audience directly and will put sort of funny asides in and nice little lines, which really adds something. And it sort of feels a bit like some of his stand-up, maybe you sort of feel like you're getting a bit of a stand-up set in amongst this autobiographical comedy. So it's really charming, really sweet. And there's 6 episodes that are all dropping on ITVX on Thursday, the 1st of June.
That sounds like a great choice. Now, your second one is what I'm really looking forward to, having just watched the McEnroe film on Amazon Prime, which is an intimate portrait itself, one of the most explosive and compelling sporting icons in tennis. And interestingly, McEnroe was directed by Barney Douglas and recently won a Sports Emmy for Best Editing Long Form. I say that because the Emmys are brought to you by the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences in the States, which has a very similar remit to the RTS. And actually, your choice is Gods of Tennis, BBC Two. So I think I'm going to love this one.
Well, I would say you're a massive tennis fan. Absolutely, you'll love it. But you know what? If you're not really into tennis, if you're not a regular watcher of the game, you really do need to see this as well. So it's sort of a follow-up to the BBC's earlier documentary. It was on a few years ago called Gods of Snooker. And again, that really brought fans not only of the game, but just people who like documentaries or well-made documentaries, because it follows exactly the same pattern as that. And it's really fantastic, actually, I have to say. It gives a really condensed and thorough history of not only some of the kind of key players in the 1970s and the 80s, but it all sifts through their rivalries, the key matches, that they have incredible access, I have to say, to some phenomenal talking heads. I mean, we have John McEnroe, obviously, and Bjorn Borg, Martina Navratilova, Billie Jean King as well. And the first episode, as I say, it's just so comprehensive and a really thorough look, especially at Billie Jean King and Arthur Ashe, actually, as well, who are obviously two players who trailblazed and paved the way, both for women and also black players, respectively, in the 70s. And I think, as I say, if you're kind of, especially sort of a younger tennis fan, or you weren't around at the time where these really incredible matches played out, it makes for such fantastic viewing. And so the way they've edited it and produced it is really quite special and sets it apart, I think, from a lot of other sports documentaries. I think, there's a part here where they, cover the infamous Battle of the Sexes match between Billie Jean King and Riggs. And the drama and the tension, I mean, sort of, everybody knows the outcome of that match, and it happened many years ago. And yet, as you're seeing it unfold, you feel like you're sort of right there watching it now.
Your next pick is a new Jack Thorne four-part drama with a stellar cast. Best Interest. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I will. You have to go into this one a little bit prepared, as the subject matter is incredibly tough, which I guess you would expect from Jack Thorne, BAFTA winner, who is known for these hard-hitting dramas, Kiri, National Treasure, Help, Don't Take My Baby. He's one of the leading writers in the country, and somebody who is really unafraid to shy away from difficult topics, controversial topics. And he's done the same again here, actually. And I think this one in particular, if you're surprised if you're not on the brink of tears throughout. So you've mentioned the cast, and it really is. We have Sharon Horgan and Michael Sheen leading this one, and they play a married couple who have two daughters. Katie, who's played by Alison Howe, who people might remember from Conversations with Friends, who I think in real life is about 25, but actually she plays sort of, they don't specify the age so far, but sort of about 16, 17, and actually she does pass for that kind of age. And also another daughter called Marnie, who's played by newcomer Neve Moriarty. And the very opening scene, we see Sharon Horgan and Michael Sheen separately driving to court. There's a lot of media attention, a lot of journalists, photographers outside the court in a big hub. You see them going in, and then suddenly we rewind 7 months to see basically why they're there. And they're a very sort of happy couple. Everything's very, sort of rosy in their relationship in a way that obviously isn't hinted at in that opening scene with them being separate. And it's essentially just looking at their lives with their daughter, who has this life-limiting condition. And the whole sort of premise, the wider premise of it, is that doctors tell the couple that they think that the life should be ended of their daughter for medical reasons, and they disagree, and it goes to court. And now this is obviously a topic that we've seen in the media, many high-profile stories, and it's obviously also one that is highly contentious, highly divisive, and will spark a lot of debate. But I think for me here in particular, what really makes this stand out is Michael Sheen and Sharon Horgan's performances.
And your final top pick for June, I had to do a double take when I saw it, The Full Monty coming to Disney Plus. And obviously it's not just playing the film. This is a new series picking up 25 years after the events of the film with some of the original cast. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's one of those do not adjust your set moments. It's not 1997, but, there's a real sort of penchant, I think, to kind of tap into nostalgia by bringing back films either, with massively delayed sequels or with brand new sort of series reviving them. And again, it's the latter, as you say, that we've got here. It's a new TV series of The Full Monty with so many of the original cast. Robert Carlyle, Mark Addy, Leslie Sharp. It sort of reunites all the main players, if you want to call it that, and to kind of basically catch up with them and see where they are now over 25 years later, and how their lives have changed, or actually in a lot of the cases not changed so much. But a lot of them are sort of dads. They're also granddads now. And in the first episode, we kind of get a really strong sense of that, in particular with kind of Robert Carlyle's character and the kind of slight frosty relationship he has with his daughter Destiny, and she's, I have to say, like a big tearaway. She goes on a bit of a crime spree, but I think where perhaps if you again really enjoyed the original film, which I think it was the highest grossing film ever until Titanic came along, so obviously there's going to be a very large not only audience for this in the UK but globally. I think although we obviously get that nostalgia and the reuniting of the key characters, there's also this big focus on sort of the new generation, if you want to call it that, and similarly how they're struggling in the same way in Sheffield, where it's sort of the same problems, same societal issues. Which I think is also really interesting. But the kind of writer, Simon Beaufoy, who did the original film and has come back for this as well, he's spoken about the fact that he wanted to bring these characters into 2023 and show them kind of struggling a little bit with things like political correctness and cancel culture, that kind of thing, and they're sort of baffled by things like electronic scanners in supermarkets. So it's how they've kind of got a bit left behind and how it's slightly bewildered by the modern world.
And obviously, in the footsteps of winning a BAFTA award for Best Film back in the day. So it's got a lot to live up to. And, we saw that group of unemployed steelworkers forming a male striptease act in order to make some money. Are we going to get a reprise of that again? Or again, have times moved on where we won't be seeing the same?
Well, it is a 10-part series, so I wouldn't like to give away anything. But I feel like if as viewers you don't get that, you will feel a bit sort of cheated in that sense. It is kind of what you come to The Full Monty for. And so fingers crossed by episode 10, they'll be on stage again with their hats, leaving their hats on probably.
Hopefully we won't have to wait till episode 10, but there you go. Thank you, Francis, so much for all of your amazing picks. So that was Francis Taylor, the previews editor from the Radio Times.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for another thrilling episode of the Television Podcast. And if you're just listening to us, well, you can get us with all of your senses because you can find us on the RTS London YouTube channel as well. More platforms than Paddington. Don't forget to subscribe and follow at RTS_London, at Nadine Dereza, at Andrew Eborn.
Oh, well pronounced. And thank you so much for all our guests for joining us today, including Alison Howe, Harvey Goldsmith and Francis Taylor. And thank you for listening or watching to us as well. And next month, we'll be talking all things TV again. So until then, thank you so much for joining us. From me, Nadine Dereza.
And from me, Andrew Eborn. Goodbye.